You can find Open City at opencitymag.aaw.org. Most of the stories posted in Open City are written by fellows. Currently, Open City has two fellowships, the Neighborhoods Fellowship and the Muslim Communities Fellowship. The Neighborhoods Fellowship is a unique opportunity. Can you hear me okay? Yeah?
Yeah.
It's a unique opportunity for emerging Asian American writers to publish narrative nonfiction over the span of 6 months on the vibrant Asian American communities of New York City. The Muslim Communities Fellowship is a 6-month opportunity for emerging writers of color from communities under attack from Islamophobia to publish narrative nonfiction about Muslim communities in New York City. Both these fellowships offer $2,500 grant, skill building workshops, and publishing opportunities at Open City. I was an Open City Fellow twice, once in 2011-2012, and more recently 2017. And it was a very rich experience, and I'd like to share a few words about my experience as a fellow. To belong to the Asian American Writers Workshop is to be a member of a nurturing and supportive arts community. A gift I can't emphasize enough how important it was for me, certainly as an emerging artist. But membership to this inspiring community is also so much more. It's to be part of a dynamic consciousness. The Asian American Writers Workshop is at the cutting edge of voicing and giving shape to the evolving immigrant culture of an ever-evolving America. We live in fraught times. Many of us amidst an atmosphere of fear and bigotry directed at us. We find ourselves displaced from life as we knew it, where familiar streets and neighborhoods are now filtered through a new lens. The stifling air of authoritarianism breathes insidiously into our daily rhythms, our thoughts, our dreams. So to be a Muslim Communities Fellow was a tremendous gift, knowing that there was a platform for stories that otherwise remain hidden and anonymous liberated my creative process. At a time when Muslims and immigrants in the United States are feeling particularly targeted, the fellowship opens a vista of fertile possibilities, giving credence to voices that need to be heard and lives and issues that need to be known. My first piece for the fellowship in 2017 focused on mothers and grandmothers in Bay Ridge who are reinventing their lives in a new language, in a new country, setting out into the public sphere to advocate for their rights as new immigrants. The fellowship empowered me to explore the story in depth without worrying about being censored or edited to the point where the piece might be diminished and the voices of the subjects reduced to sound bites. The Muslim Communities Fellowship made me self-aware of my identity as a Muslim woman writer, something I hadn't given much attention to before. The fellowship made me think, too, about the responsibility that I have to shatter ossified stereotypes of Muslims through dynamic and nuanced storytelling. I was inspired each day of the fellowship period, knowing that my work was richer for its layering of rights and justice issues, unfolding rapidly in real time and critically affecting the lives of so many immigrants, while at the same time I aspired to literary craftsmanship in character-driven, creative nonfiction storytelling. The fellowship was a real gift, and the workshop remains a home.
Okay, so by the way, thank you. Application for the next round of fellowships is ongoing. The deadline has been extended to July 15 this year. So for both the Neighborhoods Fellowship and the Muslim Communities Fellowships, deadlines for both fellowships are extended until July 15th. So if you are an Asian American, a Muslim American, and you feel strongly about class, racial, gender, equality issues, we strongly encourage you to apply. Or you might help us spread the word. You might know someone who might be interested in the fellowship.
We will have the first 3 fellows read their pieces, and then we'll have a short intermission before resuming with the next 3 fellows. We have refreshments at the back, and please feel free to partake of the small feast that we have prepared for you tonight.
And by the way, the fellows prepared a chapbook for you guys, and it's actually on the seat, so you should probably get a copy now under your seat. You're probably sitting on it right now. So let's get this party started.
Thank you.
So let's start. So I'd like to call Open City Fellow Nora Salem to introduce our first reader.
Hi. There's so many of you. So thank you for coming. Before we get started, I just want to say thank you from all of the fellows to Noel for being such an amazing editor, for giving us an amazing 6 months. Thank you. I really appreciate it. And I'm here to introduce Mohammed. So I'm going to read his bio. Mohamad Saleh, can you hear me? Is a Palestinian writer, editor, and translator. He was born in Amman and immigrated to Brooklyn at age 8. He writes about the Arab-Muslim experience in the United States, living in New York, and overly serious literature no one reads. That's his bio, but I want to say something about Mohammed because I know Mohammed is a friend, and I want to say some things that I really adore about Mohammed. I think my favorite thing about Mohammed is that he always goes for it, regardless of anything that's keeping him back, right? So, and that's something that I really admire and I wish I could do more of. For example, creating this amazing animation of his own creative work. It was really beautiful. Or, just asking if he can have an extra AAWW tote bag, which, to be fair to Mohammed, when I was there, I was like, can I have one too? Can I do that? And I got one, and we both got tote bags. Thank you, Mohammed, for that. No, but in all seriousness, I've read what he's going to read tonight, and I can say that you guys are all in for a treat, and I think that we're all collectively in for a treat in seeing where Mohammed takes his career. I'm really excited to see it. Thank you, Mohammed.
Thank you very much. Thank you for that lovely introduction, Nora. Very kind of you. So I'm going to be reading an abridged excerpt from the first piece I published with Open City called Left on 86th. I structured it as a walk through my neighborhood, Bay Ridge, after a racist encounter I had, just so that you guys have some idea of what's going on. Okay. Though constituted by multiple streets and avenues, Bay Ridge's soul is anchored and defined by two, Fifth Avenue and Third. Fifth is home to one of, if not the most vibrant communities of migrant and expat Arabs in the United States. Close to its northern end, between 68th Street and Bay Ridge Avenue, lies Masjid Mus'ab, a mosque some would describe as very conservative, others as only appropriate. For years, it was and continues to be a focal point of the Bay Ridge Muslim community, as well as the New York Muslim community at large. From Masjid Mus'ab down to 86th Street, Fifth Avenue is full of stores peddling everything from foods and textiles imported from the Middle East, to travel packages to Mecca for Umrah and Hajj. Many of the shops have characteristic awnings emblazoned with names in both Arabic and English. I spent most of my adolescence crawling from one end of the neighborhood to the next, from the arcades next to the Alpine Theater adjacent to the mosque, down to what I still believe was the first Five Guys in Brooklyn. I had my hair cut at a barbershop with a funny English name, owned by a Palestinian man we'll call Ashraf. Naturally, the barbershop was nicknamed Ashraf's. One day, during my sophomore year of high school, one of Ashraf's employees gave me a mullet. He ran his hands through the party in the back and assured me it was, quote, sexy. I wasn't so sure. I didn't cut my hair for another 6 months. The business in the front grew unruly, and the party in the back became a riot. Based on the extent to which Arabs have been able to cultivate a community of their own along Fifth Avenue, an observer may never know the kind of racial tensions that have characterized Bay Ridge over the last few decades. As of the 2010 census, the neighborhood's racial makeup is 66.4% white, 1.8% black, 0.1% Native American, and 13.3% Asian. Where Arabs lie on the limited spectrum is unclear. The uncertainty is exacerbated by the fact that some of us are forced to identify as white, as per the census questionnaire, which identifies a white person as anyone of European, North African, or Middle Eastern descent. Given an alternative universe where Arabs aren't villainized and othered by the US and Europe, it's possible that we would have slipped into white America. that, like our southern European neighbors, we would have enmeshed ourselves in whiteness so as to achieve elevated social standings and economic status. Our souls be damned. The reality is that Arabs in the US, especially in a neighborhood like Bay Ridge, are adjacent to a deep gulf, with white America located squarely on the other side. On the corner of 86th Street and Rich Boulevard, I stand and consider a neighborhood oddity. 3 schools, standalone educational institutions, all within literal steps of one another. On the corner of 85th and Ridge is the Demetrios and Georgia Kaloidis Parochial School. It's presumably open to all, but aggressively marketed to students of Greek descent. At least that's what I infer from the Greek flag adorning the school's outermost facade. Facing it and occupying the whole block from 85th to 86th is the Adelphi Academy of Brooklyn. A prep school with tuition in the tens of thousands of dollars per annum, Adelphi's students attend etiquette classes, wear the usual prep school uniforms, and peer down from a building set along a hill which seems intended to inspire awe, but only ever reminds the viewer of the elite boarding schools sprinkled across New England. Across the street from Adelphi is PS 185, Bay Ridge's local public elementary school. For years, scaffolding enwrapped PS 185 like an external shell the school could not or would not shed, and its playgrounds resembled an archaeological dig. Today, it gleams in the winter sunlight, as though it can finally puff its chest out and look its wealthy cousin across the street in the eye. Only one of the 3 schools appeals to a specific religio-ethnic group. The Demetrios and Georgia Kaloidis Parochial School distinguishes Bay Ridge as a uniquely Greek space. The school's location is partly the reason why every September, the annual Greek Heritage Festival is held on Ridge Boulevard, between 86th and 83rd Street. I wonder what I always wonder when I think about our cousins north of the Mediterranean. How was it for the first Greek migrants to Brooklyn? Did they have to endure the rage of white locals? I'm reminded of something a high school acquaintance, who is of both Italian and Greek descent, once told me in describing her family. It's a little bit of mozzarella, it's a little bit of feta. I don't think Bay Ridge's Greeks were forced to endure the rage to the extent that we do because, in the final estimation, Greece isn't foreign. The first Greek migrants to the US may have been considered different or unusual, may have had to withstand a mean joke or two, but the state of Greece was never the source of unending fear. The Greek presence isn't perceived as a threat to the social and cultural fabric of the community. Feta-covered gyros, gyros, however you want to pronounce it, are as welcome in a Bay Ridge buffet as mozzarella-covered pasta. Greeks are allowed to exist unbothered because they are, at this exact historical and cultural moment, not considered a threat to whiteness. And, thank God, Arabs are. Thank you. Thank you very much. Before I get going, I'm going to introduce the next reader and writer. Maryam Mir is a writer, strategist, and aspiring filmmaker. Born in Germany, raised in Bahrain, of Kashmiri origin, and with Canadian and Kenyan history, she is fascinated by stories of fromness, identity, and home. She has spent the last 3 years at SY Partners, a creative consultancy focused on helping organizations transform their cultures through storytelling and design. She'll be studying at NYU this fall, pursuing an MFA in film. Maryam is one of the kindest human beings I've ever met, a nourishing artist, and a truthful soul. Please, everybody, big round of applause for Maryam Mir. Thank you.
Hi, everyone. We have a lot of folks standing in the back. I'm wondering if you can raise your hand if there's an empty seat next to you. Okay, not very many, but if anyone needs a seat, please feel free to sneak into one of those seats. Thank you so much. Thanks, y'all.
Thank you, Mohammed. Oh my God, there's so many people here. So I'm going to read about Marhaf Hamsi, a Syrian baker in Bay Ridge, and I first heard about him in April 2017 when I read a New York Times article about him. He had just moved to Bay Ridge from Hama, where he ran a bakery for 30 years. And what really struck me in the article was the way he talked about his baklava and his baking. He said, "My baklava has delicate feelings." He said they need to take time to get a suntan in the oven. So he really showed that he had a passion for baking. And during this time, it was at the height of the Muslim ban, the travel ban. And I've was living in Brooklyn, and I felt helpless, and I realized he lives in Brooklyn, and so do I. So I found his website and his email, and I reached out. And over the course of a few months, a small team and I redesigned his website and created a short video for him. And then when I started this fellowship, I realized I wanted to tell his story and give voice to it. So I wrote a short profile of him. So I'm going to be reading that today. Before that, I wanted to share the short video we created. So we're going to show that, and then I'll read.
كان عمري شي 14 سنة. بنتي المرحومة والدتي. والدتي من مواسم الساحل. اشتغلنا احنا عيلة كبيرة يعني بيعملوا كذا صينية. علمتني خوت صرت انا اعمل لهم بدالها.
The nuts need to take time to love each other, Marhaf Hamsi says. His knife licks the board as he slices a gathering of walnuts into a small canyon. After a lifetime spent baking, it is here in this place of cutting up that he is made whole. At 78 years old, over 60 of those years spent perfecting his craft, Marhaf's ingredients are like old friends, the kind that slip quietly into the cracks of everyday life, those that when they surround you feel just like home. Creating baklava, his signature dessert, is a meticulous process. Spoonfuls of chunky, orange blossom-infused walnuts are spread between layers of phyllo, already gleaming with hints of ghee. Before the baklava is put in the oven, Marhaf creates space for the ingredients to simply sit. I let them rest so they can connect, he says. A gentle rhythm fills him as he chops and layers and brushes and pours. Time is a measure he cultivates and makes his own, portioning it out based on what the ingredients need, a process where slowing down is a prerequisite to making his work better, and the waiting, as the baklava puffs to life in the oven, creates space to pause and reflect. In a city that rewards speed, watching Marhaf Hamsi bake, then, can feel like an act of faith, a reminder of the wisdom inherent in allowing things to just be and emerge as they need to. In mid-2016, Marhaf moved from Hamma, Syria, the city he was born and raised in, to Bay Ridge in Brooklyn. With few possessions from the life he left behind and very few roots in the life he was coming into, he found grounding in what he knew best, baking. Marhaf learned to bake from his mother when he was 14 years old in his hometown of Hamma. Every holiday, his mother would make tray after tray of sweets, a delight to his 10 siblings and all the relatives that would congregate at their house. Sometimes their home was so full there wasn't even room to walk, corridors spilling with cousins and children, their fingers sticky with the last breath of fresh pastry. As Marhaf's mother grew older, he took over the responsibility for holiday baking, and soon he was chief baker of the Hamsi household. The pursuit of this passion as a career happened by coincidence. There was a bakery next to our house. I bought a quarter of it in the beginning, then I bought half, then 3/4, then all of it, then it became mine. As Marhaf discovered the gaps in his knowledge, he simply found a way to learn them, seeking out and shadowing neighboring bakers, studying their techniques, and innovating on his own. Over a period of over 30 years, Marhaf developed and grew his business, Al-Kindi Bakery, to a 14-employee operation. He sold an array of delicacies, including ma'moul, kunafa, croissants, and of course his famed baklava, the treat that customers would come from miles away to buy. Upon moving to Brooklyn, the first thing Marhaf was determined to do was restart his bakery business. Along with the help of his family's neighbors and his surrounding community, he set up Sweet Refuge, an online store to sell his goods. In February 2017, the New York Times picked up his story, featuring him in their dining section, a tribute to his craftsmanship and resilience. Marhaf received over 1,000 orders in the 2 weeks following the New York Times piece, and he and his wife, Noel, worked day and night without stopping to cater to the spike in demand. Over the months following the piece, however, interest faded and sales declined as the story was buried and forgotten. Orders thinned out to 1 or 2 trays a week, yet Marhaf continued to bake, tray after tray, as habit or ritual or a deeper desire to create and connect. Some days he would go for walks around his home, hoping for new orders to come through while he was gone. He just wants as many people as possible to try his baklava. It's what makes him happy, his daughter-in-law told us.
In Hama, the holiday season was what Marhaf lived for. Orders were placed weeks in advance of Eid, as wealthy businessmen bought sweets for every member of their family, for their kids and their kids' kids, a generous tradition of gift-giving wrapped up in single orders that weighed up to 50 kilos. During these times, 8-hour shifts morphed into 16 consecutive hours of labor, the team baking day and night to fulfill the heightened demand. Here in New York, one tray may sell to 100 customers. It's different, he tells us. As Marhaf adapted to his new environment, he noted the nuances. Where in Syria, one person ordered their weight in pastries, here one customer bought 2 pieces of baklava. With orders coming in from all across the USA, Florida to Arkansas to California, Marhaf reflected on how few he received in his new home city, New York, despite the population density and concentration of potential customers. Western individualism played out through portion size and order numbers. What I miss most? Companionship, friendship, siblings, nephews, family around you, he tells us. In the absence of that community, Marhaf's work sustains him. Here, people connect over work and income. You have to work. If you don't work, you can't live. There is no job I wouldn't do. I have to work. I can't not work, he says. Marhaf often pauses before speaking, as though he is turning words over in his head as he does dough, kneading his thoughts until they become more palpable. One time, a customer told me they tasted love because the sweets melted in her mouth. It's the love you bring to it. Professions are the same. If you love your profession, you excel at it. If you don't love it, you don't. Refugee is not a title that Marhaf likes, yet is often placed on him, a way of understanding his situation or categorizing him as other. The name of his new business? Sweet Refuge. A clever inversion of power, a way of reclaiming the refugee title and making it his own. Instead of a fleeing from, it becomes a coming home, a refuge, a place to stay, if even for a moment. Thank you. So I'm going to introduce Syma Mohammed. Syma Mohammed has written for The National, The Herald, The Guardian, and Tim Media. This year, she worked on a documentary film about the Muslim ban and Muslim American activism in the age of Trump. Syma holds a master's degree in gender studies from New York University, where she was the managing editor of literary arts journal submissions from students on the university's prison education program. She was also one of the editors for the Literacy Review, an annual journal of writing from adult literacy programs across New York City. Over the past 6 months, I've gotten to know Syma as a writer, thinker, collaborator, and friend. She has a unique combination of both immense strength and compassion. During our fellowship, she has showed up to every meeting fully present while also navigating the struggle that is finding housing in New York City. She's reported on the marginalized and making space and has made space for her community. Often after each workshop, Syma and I would take the train home. Over these rides, I got to know her. I was always struck by how supportive and curious she was about everyone around her, asking questions to understand another experience. And just today, before the reading, we were all nervous. We were talking on our WhatsApp group, and she asked us a question. What would be a life without being fully human? She told us. This is the spirit she brings, and we'll share it with you all today.
Thanks, Maryam. I actually feel like I'm going to cry after that introduction. It's very sweet and very generous. Good evening, everyone. Welcome to the Asian American Writers Workshop, and thank you for joining us this evening. We're really excited that you can be here and listen to our stories. I'm going to tell you or read my story about Syma Mohammed, who's pictured here on the left, and he has a food cart in Jackson Heights, in the area known as Little Bangladesh. And he's in his 80s, and he, obviously, like I said, is undocumented, and he's in that position where he's here and ready to go home. His son-in-law died last summer. He hasn't been home for 30 years, and he's in that place where home is almost no longer home. And if you've in a place for so long, and it becomes home, it keeps ties on you in a way that somewhere that you haven't seen for so long can't. So I'm just going to talk about that dilemma. When I approached Syma's food cart on a cold mid-January afternoon, he's sitting huddled over a bar stool behind his open-air cart with only a single large blue and yellow umbrella and several layers of clothes to protect him from the elements. He's dressed in trademark New York black, wearing a padded black anorak, loose black trousers, black trainers, and a black hat. The only color that breaks up his outfit is a camel scarf with black and pink checks. Initially, he has it wrapped around his neck, and after an hour, he wraps it around his head, like from the top of his head to his chin, in the way that some people from the Indian subcontinent do, and then he puts his hand on top. Although the street is busy, with a steady stream of people walking by, not a single customer approaches while I am there, although several elderly men pass by and say hello. One stops to hand Sunwar a steaming cup of chai. Sunwar points to one of the shops on the other side of the streets and tells me that one of his friends has sent it over. At one point, he goes across the street to a Bangladeshi restaurant to buy his dinner, which consists of a medium-sized container of fluffy rice. He also buys me a cup of hot milky chai, even though I'd previously declined it, but the heat emanating from the cup is a welcome respite from the cold and temporarily warms my fingers, which are numb after only 45 minutes standing there. I ask him whether he gets a lot of customers, and he says, not many people come at this time of the year, but what am I going to do sitting at home? I nod, not really understanding the great unhardiness that drives an elderly man to sit outside for approximately 8 hours a day with virtually no hope of financial return during one of the most frigid months of the year, a month that turns even the most sociable New Yorkers into homebodies. Sunwar does not have any family members in New York. He hasn't physically seen his children since they were aged 10, 11, 6, and 5 years old. He has missed the marriages of his 2 daughters and the death of one of his sons. He makes do with phones and photos and phone calls from his family, and in turn he sends them the money he earns. He now has grandchildren whose photos he proudly shows me on his mobile phone, along with snaps of people, of customers who have visited his cart, and a picture of Cynthia Nixon, the former Sex and the City candidate, actress who visited him during her election campaign for governor of New York. During my first conversation with him, I ask him if he gets lonely, and he tells me, no, I have God. And when I ask him if he looks back and has any regrets coming to the US, he tells me, why have regrets? What purposes do having regrets serve? I ask him if he's looking forward to returning home, and he tells me yes. However, the second time I meet him, he tells me he's not looking forward to going home. I have family, but no real family left, he says. My daughters are married, my son is left. Allah knows what I will do. My heart doesn't feel like going back. I don't have a green card. Once I go, I can't come back. If I had a green card, I could come and go. I prefer here to Bangladesh. I don't know Bangladesh anymore. I've been here for 30 years. Here is better for me. His voice breaks. It is the most emotional I've seen him. In a third conversation, he tells me that he has no choice but to go home. The perils of growing old as an undocumented immigrant loom large. He would like a green card, but since he doesn't have one, he can't stay. My mind is made up. I'm old and only getting older. I'm lonely, and my family is lonely. He worries about dying alone. Dying alone is something I always think about. He expresses concern about the healthcare system in Bangladesh. It's hard to see a doctor. Medicine is expensive. I get free medicine here, he says, and pulls out 2 asthma inhalers and 3 medicine bottles out of a bag. When I ask him if he has any health conditions, he says everything hurts and motions to the left and right side of his torso. Sunwar's cart displays posters of jalmuri, a street food which is largely made of puffed rice and black chickpeas, garnished with spices and cilantro, and punctuated with a sharp tang of lemon juice. It is a popular snack in Bangladesh and East India. He proudly tells me that he is the first person to sell the crunchy, savory snack in the US, along with fall rat pan, a preparation that is widely consumed in the Indian subcontinent and consists of an areca nut mixture wrapped in green betel leaves. Despite the hurdles he has faced, Sunwar has managed to carve out a reputation for himself. His jalmuri was featured in the late Anthony Bourdain's Parts Unknown blog, where it was described as a sensory overload of a snack consisting of puffed rice, black chickpeas, chopped tomatoes, green chili paste, red onions, crunchy dried soybeans, cilantro, spicy fried noodles, and mustard oil. The Fung brothers, I don't know if you know them, meanwhile ferried his jalmuri as a spicy, savory trail mix on their YouTube channel. Syma is also featured in an exhibition which examined the contribution and sacrifices the Bangladeshi community have made to the food culture in New York. The exhibit took place at the Museum of Food and Drink in Brooklyn last summer. He's also managed to carve out a community. Through his food cart, he's an established figure in Little Bangladesh in Jackson Heights. People in the community recognize and interact with him. He's referred to as Jalmuri Dada, basically the grandfather of Jalmuri, or Bal Dada, which means singing grandfather because of the Bangladeshi folk songs he sings. When Drum launched its fundraising campaign for him, community members rushed to the rescue, and a few people offered to buy his flight ticket home. But as Syma's return home draws nearer, it's something he continues to be ambivalent about. To physically return home is simple enough. One gets on a plane, and in a matter of days and hours, one is there. But to mentally and emotionally return home is a different thing. After nearly 40 years, is home still home, or is it a foreign country and or a land full of strangers? And if it doesn't prove to be what one expects or wants it to be, there is no option to return to the place that has been home for most of your adult life. Thank you.
We will have a 5-minute intermission, during which time feel free to stretch out. Or we have drinks at the back. We have chai. We prepared chai for you. We have dumplings. And we also have baklava, which we ordered from Marha. Okay, so 5 minutes.
Okay. Hi again, everyone. Don't worry, I'm not reading again. I'm just here to introduce Hannah Bae, who many of you will know here. Hannah is the president of the Asian American Journalists Association. She's also a freelance writer and illustrator with her husband, Adam. She started her journalism career out in South Korea and came back to the US and started working, obviously, for quite a while at CNN. She's now working on her memoir, and the piece that she'll be reading next is actually a personal essay, and it's going to be the meat part of what's going to be her memoir. So about Hannah. Hannah was actually the only person I knew before I started this fellowship, and testimony to the sweet person that Hannah is, when she saw my name, I'd only met her once or twice, well, definitely once, but maybe twice, she wrote me an email saying, "Hey, Syma, it's so great that you were on this fellowship too, and we'll get to hang out." And what's been really beautiful is getting to know Hannah both as a person and as a writer. Seeing her grow, I think she's a beautiful writer, and I think that she's also just a very beautiful person with a really big heart. She is always so enthusiastic. She will always give feedback and always be supportive. She'll even send me jobs. She is just a wonderful all-around person. So please give it up for Hannah Bae.
Thank you so much, Syma. That's such a moving intro. So I'm just going to tilt this down. Thank you, everyone, for coming. I'm going to be reading passages from the essay, The Give and the Take, that I wrote for Open City. I think the subtitle is pretty self-explanatory. It's How Caring for Children is Helping Me Reckon with My Own Childhood Abuse. Why are you interested in working on issues of domestic violence, human trafficking, and sexual assault? My fingers hovered over the keyboard as I considered the words on screen. I had decided that morning, the day after the 2016 presidential election, to sign up to volunteer for a local nonprofit now called Womankind. It was a big, heavy question for me. How could I boil down my experience, my childhood stay in foster care, the decade of domestic violence that my family endured, my history that I'd buried for 20 years, down to a few sentences fit for a stranger to read on a volunteer application? I tapped out my answer, frank and restrained. Advocating on behalf of Asian Americans is important to me. I'm a child who survived domestic violence, and I'm passionate about protecting women and children. More than 2 years have passed since I sent in that volunteer application, and in retrospect, I see that second sentence as an act of radical honesty. I'm a child who survived domestic violence. It was in that moment, when I was stunned over who my country had elected as chief of state, that I felt that I could act on my truth. I saw myself as I clicked through the pages of the Womankind website in the photos of women and children with skin tones in golden, chestnut, and espresso. These clients were people like me. Perhaps, as one of their own, I could do something to help them. So Rob, if we can move to the next slide, please. So as a child, I kept a detailed diary from the age of 6, and I recently returned to its well-worn Hello Kitty printed pages to see what I could piece together of foster care. This is the first entry, May 8th, 1995. Dear Diary, I am in a foster home. I'm going to a different school. It is called GF Folsom. My teacher is Miss Shopman. She knows Mrs. Brooks. When I compared this entry to surrounding dispatches, the flatness of its tone stood out. While I relished signing off on almost every other entry with quips like, hugs and kisses from 95, Hannah. This time I didn't sign my name. In the displacement of foster care, I didn't document any thoughts about my family, who didn't feel much like comfort. The only tie back to home that I could bear to acknowledge was my 4th grade teacher, Mrs. Brooks, whom I had left behind at my old school when authorities pulled me from my parents' home. To me, these sentences read noticeably, painfully numb and sparse. And next slide, please, Rob. We want to grow up, read the banner hanging above a wall packed with children's drawings at Womankind's Brooklyn community office. I was there for a volunteer assignment to photograph their press conference in Sunset Park. On the wall, one drawing included this caption and a credit line to an 8-year-old Chinese girl. I don't have any wishes because now I am returned to mom. I didn't mean to act out this line, but a hint of tears tickled at the corners of my eyes as I felt an affinity for the author of this hopeful message. Her youthful drawings felt so sweet and so vulnerable. Like me, this little Asian girl had been separated from her parent and returned. I snapped a photo, even though it wasn't part of my assignment that day. When I wrote in my diary during foster care, I left a full 2 pages blank. Maybe 9-year-old me intended to fill them in later with more reflections on foster care once I was ready. And maybe I couldn't bear to write about those horrible days after all. I had wanted to forget. I never imagined that I would take on a childcare role at Womankind. Everything about this type of volunteering falls outside of my comfort zone. Before Womankind, I never thought I had a reason to visit Sunset Park, although it's only a few subway stops south of my apartment. Before Womankind, I had babysat only once, and even after many months, I still don't feel fully at ease taking care of children. Luckily, there's always backup. But giving of myself is not about only doing what is comfortable. It's about putting someone else's needs before mine. At Womankind, child care is part of the equation for clients. By knowing that their children are in safe hands, parents, usually mothers, can do the hard work of extracting themselves from violent situations and healing their traumas with the help of Womankind's social workers and client advocates, professionals who look like them, speak their languages, and understand their cultures. It's a huge contrast to my family's experience with Child Protective Services in Florida, where no one not the police, not the foster parents, not a single social worker, was of East Asian descent. I've been a journalist for more than 10 years, and we pride ourselves on being tough. But as I've learned to be soft and gentle, it's been surprising to see how quickly many of the kids bond to caregivers. How quickly a dumpling-like baby will settle into a carrier strapped to my chest. How a black-haired toddler will want to hold my hand and lead me around the playroom within the span of a few hours. As a fellow Asian American, I wonder if they feel comfortable around me because I look like them and their mothers. I wonder if I see myself in them. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you so much, everyone. I practiced a lot today, and I really tried not to cry. But I had such amazing support from my fellow cohort of amazing Open City writers, and I'm so grateful. And it's my very great privilege next to introduce Astha Rajvanshi. I knew of Astha before this fellowship started because she had some mutual friends of mine from Columbia Journalism School. I didn't go there, but my very talented and smart friends did. And they told me that Astha is amazing, and she had been to South Korea, which is my second homeland, and I was just so excited to get to know her, and it's been such an honor to get to know her work and her writing and her work ethic. She works at the New York Times Magazine full-time, in addition to reporting and researching and writing for this fellowship, and her talent is incredible, and I am so excited for you to hear about her piece on Indian American and South Asian representation in media. And I'm going to read her bio. So in addition to working at the New York Times Magazine, previously Astha was a reporter and researcher for Reuters, and she was a fact checker for The Nation and a reporting fellow for Columbia Journalism School's Global Migration Program. She writes on women, immigration, and the legal system, and she is amazing. So, Astha, take it away.
I can confirm that there are a lot of you here, so thank you for being here. This piece came out of last year, my experience of making a web series for the first time. I had absolutely no idea what I was doing, and it was a real process, but I think it was really important for me, and one of the reasons why was because I realized that I just wanted to see someone like me in a show or a film, and so that led to this desire to write this piece. So this is an excerpt from that. I was a teenager in suburban Sydney, Australia, when I went to the cinema in my local shopping centre and watched Mira Nair's The Namesake. Although I'd read Jhumpa Lahiri's novel of the same name, the film simply overwhelmed me. When I was growing up, my parents never identified our immigrant experience as part of the Indian diaspora, but in The Namesake, I saw it mirrored in the generational saga of a Bengali family, grappling with its roots while assimilating to America. It was the first time I'd seen a Hollywood screen filled with only South Asian actors, where the white girlfriends and best friends stuck out like sore thumbs against a palette that was palpably desi. I could identify with every small detail, from the polite mannerisms and their way of dressing, the bindi on Tabu's forehead, the straw chappals on her feet, to the sitar, the sweets, and the colourful drapes that embellished the sets. It was 2006, just a few years after the release of Harold and Kumar Go to the White Castle, a film that starred Chinese American and Indian American actors in lead roles. No doubt they were crass caricatures of Asian Americans, but in post-9/11 America, the film subverted all the stereotypes attached to those who resembled Kal Penn and John Cho. These films came and went without much ado. In hindsight, it almost seems as if they were ahead of their time, paving the way for recent releases like The Big Sick, Crazy Rich Asians, and Always Be My Maybe, now hailed as triumphs for minority representation in Hollywood. In film and television, there has been an increasing visibility of South Asian actors. Mindy Kaling in The Office, The Mindy Project, and her latest release, Late Night, Aziz Ansari in Parks and Rec, and the Netflix series Master of None, Kumail Nanjiani in his Oscar-nominated comedy The Big Sick. No longer does the audience see South Asian actors conforming to old whitewashed stereotypes of cab drivers, convenience store workers, or geeky sidekicks. It has become possible to reimagine how actors, writers, and producers tell their own story. But these possibilities have come with a reckoning too. In the 80s and 90s, the most recognizable South Asian on TV was an over-exaggerated Apu on The Simpsons. When the comedian Harry Kondabolu asked why, for so long, South Asians were confined to a racist caricature with an offensive accent, the showrunners simply responded with, "Some things will be dealt at a later date." What does it mean to deal with these things? When Rita Sen Gupta, who is here in the audience actually, moved from Washington, D.C. to New York to pursue acting full-time, she heard the same thing from people at auditions. It's a great time to be you in the industry right now. The 27-year-old actor and comedian auditioned for the supporting role of a funny best friend, a role that came with the physical description of ethnically ambiguous. At the audition, a white actor lamented to her, "It's tough right now, but I'm sure you're getting a lot of callbacks." It was hilarious, Sengupta said. I thought to myself, don't you realize we're both auditioning for the same thing, but you're the lead? It just felt very hypocritical. A study by the University of Southern California found that Asian Americans represent 1% of all leading roles in Hollywood. In 1983, Ben Kingsley, whose father is Indian, won an Academy Award for Best Actor for his role as Mahatma Gandhi. Since then, no other actor of Asian heritage has won that award. This absence of diverse actors and experiences on American screens doesn't just reflect the underrepresentation. It has a profound effect on the collective psyche of South Asians. This is what ethnic erasure accomplishes. It imagines worlds without the very existence of South Asian people, writes Canadian writer Fiona Khan. Representing whiteness as the norm and framing white stories as universal renders everything else as abnormal. Sengupta, a queer South Asian woman, decided she wanted to be an actor at a time when Oscars So White was trending. There have been decades of white people, specifically white men, telling their stories in a variety of ways and characters, she said. We're at a point where it's really important for us to create our own stories, because no one is going to do that for us. Thanks. Thank you. It is my great pleasure to introduce the next speaker, Nora Salem, who's a writer, teacher, and textile artist. She's a Mexican and Egyptian American, and Nora finds the intersections of identity and community particularly interesting. She received her MFA at Virginia Tech and then spent a year in Kuala Lumpur, Malaysia, working on a Fulbright research project that focused on the liberation theology and feminism in Muslim practice. She then after moved back to New York, where she currently lives, obviously, and worked at the Arab American Association of New York, where she served as an adult education manager and taught ESOL to a diverse group of Arab immigrants from countries like Yemen, Palestine, Egypt, and more. Currently, she's an adjunct lecturer at Beirut College. So Nora, I was trying to figure out how to describe Nora. I think the best way to do it just happened literally like 30 minutes ago when I was like, oh my God, I'm so nervous. And Nora says, yeah, but like, you'll go on stage. And I was like, oh, okay. She has this way of somehow saying something really random, but at the same time, you just feel somehow reassured that everything is going to be okay. She's really hilarious, and she also has amazing taste in food. We went on a food tour recently, and Nora was like listing all these names of places that we could go and eat food at, and it was a real treat. You'll get to read about it soon in an article that we'll write. But outside of that, I just wanted to also plug her amazing Instagram account, which she runs with her husband. It's basically an artist space, and it's at cu.lf. Please check it out because it's amazing. And yeah, please welcome her to the stage.
Hi. I am back. It's going to be a lot less lighthearted. This one is about the NYPD, so it will be accordingly dark. Okay. So this is primarily about surveillance of the Muslim community in New York. And I guess I should say that a lot of this piece is structured around the people that I interviewed, and so I'm going to be sort of introducing them at each different section. Hopefully it makes sense. If it doesn't, read it. So Beit al-Maqdis, which is right there, a mosque in Sunset Park but edging on the border of Bay Ridge, has 56 Google reviews, all of which average an excellent 4.7 stars. Very good, wrote Syma Mohammed, rating Beit al-Maqdis 5 stars. Ibrahim Achil likes that it's easy to find parking. He gave it 3 stars. The act of rating a place of worship is a funny one, but it's not that uncommon. The Sistine Chapel has 9,000 Google reviews. The Dome of the Rock has nearly 2,000. Yet there's something more unsettling about the reviews of this mundane masjid in a low-traffic corner of southern Brooklyn. Everybody seems to want you to know how peaceful it is here, and clean. These are good people, the reviews assure you. Their authors all have Muslim names. When I was working at Beit al-Maqdis, or BAM as we called it, running an adult education program for the Arab American Association of New York, a man threw a brick through the window of the community center. He didn't enter or try to rob the place. Beyond excessive online reviews, another sign of our times is the occasional outburst of inexplicable violence. Perhaps for that reason, this one barely drew notice. No one was hurt, no threats were made. Nonetheless, the message was clear. Watch yourself. But no one had to tell us that. For the Muslim American community in the aftermath of 9/11, the fear of being watched is common. But it wasn't until 2011 when the Associated Press published a series of 10 articles on NYPD surveillance of the Muslim community in New York City that the reality those fears are based in was widely recognized. A few months later, the police department issued a press release in response to the AP series claiming that the NYPD surveillance program successfully thwarted 14 terrorist plots. However, according to a report on NYPD spying and its impact on American Muslims, the majority of these cases were either so lacking in credibility that charges were never brought, or worse, were plotted and enabled mainly by a government informant. Mapping Muslims proved that merely speaking in certain languages, particularly Urdu or Arabic, could trigger surveillance. In 2006, just as the surveillance program was put into place, the NYPD published an internal report that classified nearly every quotidian act of observant Islamic practice, from wearing Islamic clothing to giving up drinking, as typical signatures of radicalization. Was this willful ignorance or an outright attempt to criminalize a specific religion? Does it matter? What did matter was that no one was safe. The NYPD didn't only have informants in local mosques, they also regularly visited hotspots in Muslim neighborhoods, or, as they were known in their community, restaurants, butcher shops, cafes. By the time the AP story broke, it was clear that the NYPD was monitoring even its closest partners in anti-terrorism work, including imams who frequently appeared at the mayor's side. This next one is the student. Magdan Kwas was a student at Brooklyn College when the infamous story of NYPD undercover cop Mel broke in 2015. Mel's identity was discovered when 2 women in Queens were convicted of planning to build a bomb based on her intelligence. Mel, or Maliki Ser, had been posing as a convert in Brooklyn College Muslim student circles in order to gather information. Oh no, I lost my spot. Kwas frequented the Islamic Society Center on campus and often ran into Mel there. When she found out she was a spy, she was shocked. Around the same time, a friend of hers was picked up by FBI, sent to a holding center in El Paso, and then abruptly returned home a couple weeks later. There was never an explanation for her arrest or her release. The atmosphere led to huge fear, anxiety, and panicking all the time. Kwas recalls regularly praying that she wouldn't be targeted and picked up. She had written a paper about Hamas for a college class, and she was terrified it would land her in jail. Kwas recounted times undercover officers would knock on her door and ask seemingly innocuous questions with the intent to gain entrance into her family's home. Your natural inclination is to be helpful, she said. Just the experience of someone coming to your house and saying, can I come in for a second? Can I just turn on the light? It's a super simple thing that gives them consent to come into your house and search it that you don't even realize that you're giving. Kwas worries that one day someone will find a reason to arrest her and she won't even understand why. It's probably one of my biggest fears. I still think about coming home to find someone in my house telling me, get up, get dressed, you're out. The next section is the academic. Ibrahim Bishouri, a PhD candidate studying NYPD surveillance at Columbia, came to New York City from France in 2013, not long after the AP's report on the police program. As a well-attuned newcomer to Muslim spaces in the city, he quickly noticed the trauma. I asked him whether he thought this alienation was intentional on the part of those who developed the targeted surveillance program. He said it was, but that it mostly fails as a deterrent from acts of terrorism. It works, he said, but not on what is defined as the target. If we think the target is drugs or stopping terrorism, then it doesn't work, because people who want to engage in those activities or people who are pushed to engage in them will engage in them. Does it work as a tool of social control of those subaltern groups? Yes, definitely. In fact, it's been known to directly push people towards radical visions of Islam. In his article, The Informant, Islam and Muslims in New York, Bishouri mentions the case of Barry Bujal, a convert who had trouble getting answers about religion since many Muslims worried that he was an informant. After being arrested for outstanding traffic tickets, Bujal was purposely placed in a cell with an FBI informant who was all too eager to answer his questions about Islam. Eventually, after offering to provide support to his wife, he convinced Bujal to deliver weapons to Al-Qaeda in Algeria. Bujal was arrested en route and is now serving a 20-year sentence. In the final section, the newcomers. Mohammed Jayeb, a Palestinian American who lived in Brooklyn in the 6 years following the end of the NYPD surveillance program, worshipped at various mosques in the area. Jayeb often felt disillusioned with the imam's apparent disconnect from contemporary politics. He felt that an ideal mosque should be religious, ethical, and political, but he was shocked at how often the weekly sermons avoided any mention of current events. We had a sense that they were aware of an audience somewhere else, so they weren't playing the role they should play, he said. After all, who can be themselves with so many eyes on them? Thank you.
I'd like to welcome all the fellows up. Let's have another round of applause for our wonderful fellows.
Thank you, Tiffany.
Thank you so much, each of you, for your powerful and moving stories. They were just really, really insightful and riveting. And you've done a lot of work. And I just love the unity that you have in your cohort. It's really wonderful. So after listening, and actually I read your stories too before coming to the event today, I'm left wondering, what is home? Is home sensory? Is home a feeling? Is home a sentiment? Is it metaphysical? Is it a movement of going backward, going back into the past, from the past to the present and back? And then what happens when you can't do that? When you can't travel, either because of your immigration status or you can't travel in memory because of the trauma you've blocked out certain sections of the past. Then what is home? So, given the theme of tonight's event, I wanted to turn to each of you and ask you, did your own understanding or sense of home change, or was it clarified at all as you worked on your pieces for the fellowship? If you could speak to your relationship to home. And I think maybe we'll just go around, and who would like to begin?
No, I went first.
I'll start. Is this on? Okay. I think for me, I think this is probably like a really unpopular opinion, but I think home is probably other people for me, which is why I've been thinking a lot about community. It's also probably why I'm moving back home to California soon. And I think my understanding of home didn't change, but I definitely think it was clarified, like you said, by just sort of talking to people a lot about their community and how their community was affected by global politics and things like that. I think the thing that affected me the most about researching my story was just understanding that like the fabric of a community was completely broken down by these acts by the NYPD. And I think that there's something about that is like your home being ripped away from you, right? Especially for these immigrants and refugees who have nowhere else to be. So yeah, I think it definitely clarified it for me, yeah.
I'll go next. So for me, I think home is my present, and I feel so lucky and privileged to live in Brooklyn and to have this wonderful life now, where I feel like I am living in safety and that I finally have the kind of space where I can process what I've been through and shape it into something that is worth sharing with anyone else. And I have to say that a huge part of my feeling of safety and security comes from my wonderful husband, Adam, who's over here. And he is really teaching me so much about what it means to build a home and what it means to be a family. And I'm so grateful for his support and artistic inspiration and collaboration.
I feel bad for not mentioning my husband.
Okay. Yeah, home is a really interesting idea to me at the moment, largely because I'm actually searching for it. I think coming to America was a really sort of defining moment in my life, because every time I go back home to Australia, which is where my parents are and where I was raised, I don't feel less and less at home. But I had a really clarifying moment in the duration of the fellowship when I went to a food pantry in Queens, and that was one of the only food pantries that serves South Asian food ingredients. And there was this old woman who was sitting at the reception, and she started talking to me in Hindi, and I started talking back to her, and I think in that moment I just felt really emotional. And I don't have an answer for what home is, but I think what I realized was every time I meet someone who reminds me of my culture or anything that has to do with my identity, they start to feel like home.
I think similar to Nora, home for me is a feeling, and it's related to people, of like feeling safe, feeling seen. And writing Marhaf's piece, reflecting on it, I think what occurred to me was what happens in the absence of that community, what happens to notions of home. And I think there was a moment when I was writing the piece when I realized that baking almost became a grounding force for him, where it wasn't only a like source of his memory, but it was a way for him to move forward. A lot of immigrants or refugees that come to the U.S. or to new places, the first thing a big loss of identity is due to unemployment. They can't find the same employment that they had in their home countries. And for Marhaf, he could still use baking as a source of livelihood. And I think that was really profound for me in the absence of community. Baking, even the way he talks about it, he talks about his baking baklava, he personifies it as his friends. And so that was really interesting, seeing how it's so central to his identity of reflecting and remembering, but also moving forward and creating a new life in this place.
Yeah.
For me, I guess home is probably, I mean, it's a shifting sand, but also it's a site of privilege. For me as an immigrant to the US from the UK, to do a story on somewhere who's undocumented makes me realize the privilege I have in being able to choose a physical location of home, and that, really it's a first world problem. Can I live in New York? Can I live back home? Like, what is that, So I think for me, like, I think I got to appreciate that a lot more. And that came with just gratitude, really. But yeah, I don't know if that was eloquent enough. Thanks. On you go, Mohammed.
Yeah, thank you very much for that lovely question. For me, home is very much a process, and that's something that I came to learn over the course of the fellowship. It is not just the physical location, as the other fellows pointed out. It's people, it's the effort that you put into the relationships that you build and to the love that you might have for a particular place. And I was very lucky to have learned that over the last 18 years living here. Bay Ridge is my home, and New York is a lovely place to be.
Right. Thank you so much. Thank you. Noel, do we have time for another round of questions, or should I open it up? Should I open it up? Oh, so we'll open it up to the audience. If you have questions, I'd love to hear from you.
Thanks so much for opening up so much of your own lives. I know that's not easy. My question is how do you decide how much of yourself you open yourself up to? and how much you protect so that you can have some of yourself for yourself. So how do you find that balance? And also, how do you find that balance when you tell the stories of other people's vulnerabilities and insights?
Who would like to go first?
The question is about how much of yourself to expose, and I think that, gosh, I've been studying the craft of writing now for a few years, as you know, as a self-identified literary writer now, and there is this amazing memoirist. Her name is Rima Zaman, and she tells people to write from the scar, not write from the wound. And I think that is kind of what is guiding me in that I'm able to write about the past. I'm not writing about my present right now. I think that, one, I don't think it's going to be that interesting. It'll be like, I have a great dog. I have a wonderful husband. We cook a lot of good food. That's not a story of overcoming anything. But I think being able to have the time and space to process my past and to have an amazing therapist and to be able to then shape all of these memories into something that's hopefully going to be a work of art is the intention. But of course, I protect a lot about myself. I mean, I think that was why it took me so long to write about this, because I spent 20 years trying to be like perfect journalist, you know? And it's this whole process of chipping away at that shell.
Thank you. Would anyone else like to answer that question?
I can't speak to how delicate to be when writing about other people because I'm not a journalist like these lovely folks. It's very difficult, but what I can say is there is no protection, if I'm going to be completely honest with you, at least for me. Lean into the most difficult things. I like that expression, write from the scar, not the wound, but I found it very liberating to write from the wound. So try.
I think I just want to say something about that.
I think.
Okay. About writing about other people, because it's something that I've been thinking about a lot. I'm primarily a creative writer. I have been in the past. And now I'm trying this journalism thing. And I think it feels a lot more weighty because you suddenly have to write for other people. Like you have to embody their voice in some way. And I think it's so important to always put them first and the representation of them first over what cool writing could come out of it, right? Like I think about some of the people that I interviewed that had some really awful stories I don't think they wanted to share, and they would have been great to share, but they're not my stories. So, and it can be hard to let go of that, but I think when you're writing about other people's voices or giving voice to other people, however you want to say it, I think it's so important to just put them first. So.
Just one thing that I wanted to add was, in terms of writing about other people, one difference I found in a space like the Asian American Writers Workshop was that there are things that you don't have to both explain to each other and also worry about in terms of like technical finesse of journalism, which is so liberating because we follow such a sort of whitewashed way of writing about people in the mainstream media that I think at least this fellowship enabled me to actually have a real dialogue with someone who was trusting me with their story, as well as someone who I was giving that sort of confidence to. So I was, deeply appreciative of that.
I think the question is also making me wonder about how much you're willing to expose of yourself or share of yourself, depending on who that audience is and who you're writing among and for. So I wonder if the workshop group, also the dynamics within that group, help you either open up or close off, and how much are you willing to share depending on sort of the group dynamics? Do you think that was at play for any of you? Hannah, do I feel like... Yeah.
I mean, I cried when I read my piece, and I cried when I workshopped it for the first time with this wonderful group of people. And I mean, I felt like I could trust this group, and they helped me so much shape my piece into the form that it's in now. And I feel like we had such good chemistry. Like, we are truly friends, and I don't know if that always happens, but I love these people, and we all help each other become stronger writers, and it's so wonderful to be in a group of people who are doing the same thing and pushing toward a goal of publishing and putting out stories. It's amazing.
Thank you.
Agreed.
Do we have another question from the audience? Really? No? Yeah, there.
Hi. Oh, okay. I'm kind of curious if translation played a role in any of this, if you did any interviews or conversations in different languages, and then how that affected your writing, and if it was mentioned, or how that maybe changed your perception, if maybe you did the interview in the language and then you had to flip it over to English, or maybe you had to have somebody help translate it for you, like how that affected it and if it was part of your writing.
Thank you.
Yeah, I had to translate actually, because obviously the contributor, I mean, Sanwar, who I spoke to, speaks mainly a particular dialect of Bengali, and I actually am not a Bengali or speaker at all. And I speak a bit of Urdu, and I'm a bit of a coconut, so not very well. And so we originally I tried the interview in Urdu, and I was, and there were some bits that I got and some bits that I didn't get. And then eventually I had to ask someone to help me translate. And it's really interesting, the process of translation, because when I spoke to Somewhere one-to-one, I got a lot more personal stuff. And then I think when I had a third party come in, it put a distance as well in our communication and in our interview. So, it's really interesting for me, because as a journalist or a writer, you're translating people onto a page. And I think it's always even more difficult when there's a complicated added factor of language. But I noticed when I was reading tonight, before I read tonight, I really wanted to be able to replicate his voice. And I really had been thinking about, should I actually play these things that he's saying in his own language, because I felt that would be honoring him better than me translating it into English. But of course, it would have been harder to navigate that. But I think translation it's a real honor to be able to translate people from a different language and make it more widespread and to have people access it. But it also is difficult to, but yeah. I don't know.
I think often, it's a bit obvious to say, but when we talk about translation, we do talk about going from one language to another. But most of us were writing initially in English. And a problem that I always had writing growing up, and I think everybody here who's ever tried to write anything, is names, proper nouns, especially in proper nouns in a language that isn't English when writing in English. How do you navigate that? And I'd always had trouble with it. How much do I translate? How much do I explain in English? And it was this group that made me feel very comfortable to not really care about translating, to not explain what PLO stands for, to not explain what Hamas might be, to not explain the significance of certain years, 1948, 1967, things like that. And if I'm going to recommend anything, I would suggest to not translate. Just write. I know it's difficult. It's heartbreaking. People have a hard time connecting with stories that have names they don't recognize, that have names they don't associate with real people. But how else will another generation or a group of people understand them if we don't include them as much as we can? So please don't translate. Tell your stories.
So I wrote about Marhaf, and I actually don't speak fluent Arabic, and so a lot of our communication was through his daughter-in-law, who would be actively translating the conversation between us, and also a friend who was on our team who spoke fluent Arabic. And so I wrote my piece based on a transcribed interview and then also the conversation we had with the daughter-in-law. And this was something I struggled with a lot of, like, how do I take his voice and tone in a language that I don't understand? Is the poetry just my inference of how I perceive him to be? But I think it was because we had spent so much time with him over months, we had built a trust with him, and I think that was essential to this process of knowing and checking with the people who do speak the language, is this the tone, is this who he is this reflective of his experience? That was how I did it.
Thank you.
Sorry. I also just wanted to add an extra comment, which is that, you know, as all of us, I mean, as Asian sort of Americans, we're always in the process of translating ourselves, actually, for our mainstream. And I think probably a lot of you as audiences are aware of that, and you've done it yourselves, or, you know, you've tried to understand other people from other backgrounds or cultures. And I think, you know, I think what we were struggling to grapple with during this fellowship is that how much do we stop translating ourselves? How much do we just write, as Mohammed was saying, like, you know, acronyms or words, certain words, and just allow the audience to look it up if they want to, or just get the sense of what that means? Because there has to come a point where we don't want to translate ourselves anymore. And I think that was what the beauty of this fellowship was, of just actually, you know, learning just to be and just fully accept ourselves, but also to fully not have to want to be that position of translating, you know?
I think that just reminded me of like our last meeting, and it's kind of related to translation, but we were talking a lot about the piece that Astha read, and I just had a moment, and I like had to share it because I graduated from an MFA program a few years ago, and it was like mostly diverse, but compared to most MFA programs, but not really diverse, and like I like immediately after we had that conversation, it was mostly about representation, all that stuff. I was just like, wow. In the MFA program, we would have wasted that entire time just trying to be like, this is a problem. Like, this is something that we might want to care about, you know? And instead we had like such a good, like vibrant conversation about the tensions and the, you know, all of the complications of representation and like what is real representation and what isn't. And it was just, it made me think, and I think Hannah and I were talking about it afterwards, about that like famous Toni Morrison quote that racism is a time waster. And I think like that, I really paraphrased that, but that's it. And and I think like I really felt that in that moment, and I feel it often with this group. Like, you know, we get to the point because we understand each other, and I really appreciate that, and I appreciate the space for that.
Another question? Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you all for sharing your reading with us. I'm curious to hear from a couple of you. Were there any significant choice points or decisions that you made in your writing? And how did you navigate that process? How did you choose one thing over another, and what did that look like? Choice points. Sure, like almost building off of what you were saying about like, do I translate or not? So when you got to a decision and you had to choose one or two or three different options, how does that show up in your writing? How did that show up in the work that you shared?
I guess the first choice point was, what do we want to write about? Because the beauty of this fellowship is that it really enables you to write anything and everything that you want to write about. And because I had been so focused on immigration and racial justice, I felt like I needed to write that. And the more I spoke to people about their own personal stories, and so much of people's personal thoughts and identities were coming through in their pieces, I realized that the best way to make use of this opportunity was to actually be true to my own interests and my own personal desires to write about things. And that was a very broad decision to make, but I think it ties in with one of the questions earlier about how much do you sort of put yourself in a piece. And so I think that was a really important decision to make. And one of the beauties of being able to workshop with people is that you have that sort of support, not just on an ideological level, but also line by line, paragraph by paragraph, being able to figure out which points you want to make. And so with this piece that I read out today, I couldn't tell if I wanted to talk about Netflix and how that's changing the industry, or if I wanted to go more into the audition process, or talk about how white actors influence South Asian actors. But All of those things, I think, were much more simplified when I started to workshop the piece with a bunch of amazing editors. So, yeah.
I think one thing that was one of the biggest challenges was deciding on the beginning and the ending, like how do I start it and how do I end it. In terms of the beginning, I think I went to a talk by a director a few weeks ago, and he said, the first scene that you write is what the story is about. And I think for me, it was always this poeticism that he brought that I found really compelling and unique, and how, as I thought more about it, it was really that his baklava was real for him. It was a way of connecting to him that was deep and real. And so I think that's how I started. I tried many different openings, and that's what I ended up starting with. In terms of the end, mentioning that he was also a refugee, I think I deliberately and intentionally left that out because I think there's so many narratives that focus on being a refugee and the experience of being a refugee, and that is part of his experience, but I know that that was something he didn't want to highlight, that was something that he didn't feel was central to his identity, and so it was an intentional choice to leave it at the end and show how he had reclaimed that title and made it his own through his baking business.
Yeah, I love how you do that with Sweet Refuge, how you talk about the name and how he's reclaimed that. Yeah.
I think one of the things this fellowship has brought into stark relief for me is that the myth of the solitary writer is just that. It's a myth. You can't do it on your own. No matter how many stories you read about brilliant writers who just went off on their own and then produced a novel in 3 weeks and oh my God, this is a canonical work. That's just garbage. You need a group of people outside of yourself to tell you whether something works or not, or whether something resonates with them or not. And so finding that group of people is the biggest challenge, I think. But once you do, the writing kind of comes out. Just put everything out on the page and give it to them and don't tell them. And then they'll tell you what works and what doesn't.
I think something that question made me think about was another story that I wrote that I think will be up soon. I hope will be up soon. I'm really sick of editing it. But it's about the Muslim Community Patrol, which recently came up in Bay Ridge. And I think another reason why I want to really appreciate this group too is that I feel like one reason why I really like journalism is that it can be so confrontational. And I think everybody in this group has really encouraged me to be confrontational about a lot of stuff. And I think it would have been easy to sort of write about this and be like, oh, it's this kind of interesting, cool thing, a little weird, but interesting and cool. But instead, I think a lot of talking to you guys and thinking through a lot of this stuff really encouraged me to really question, what is this group doing, and is it doing what's best for this community, and really speaking to the community themselves rather than, just whoever reads it. Which I also appreciate it.
I think we had another question. Yeah, right there.
Hi, my name is Gavin. Just from what I've listened to so far, it seems like home constantly recenters around places of comfort and safety. And I was wondering, can home actually coexist with trauma? Is there ever a space where that could happen?
Mm-hmm. Great question, thanks.
I mean, I certainly think it can. I think that part of adulthood is learning to redefine home. But I think all parties in a family bring in their own traumas, of course. It's a really interesting and thorny question to think about. But I think so much of the human existence is suffering and suffering again. So I do think that home is inclusive of that.
I think as people, we're made up of everything that happens to us, including sites of trauma and wounds and other suffering and things like that. And I think, we just have to make home with it in some ways. It's about growing our relationship with that trauma and understanding that it's part of who we are, and that it's also not necessarily a destination that you actually reach, but is actually a process of, give and take and coming to terms with it as well, Do
we have another question? Yeah. we have a question there, and then I'll come to you after that. The person in the second row, thank you.
My question is about how your work is going to change going forward from your experience. You've alluded to this in terms of the way that you think about a lot of concepts and even the things that you're much more open to talking about or writing about. But being that the fellowship, is a fixed period of time and or even the moments in which you were meeting up regularly, I'm really interested in what you thought about had the biggest change in your work, even in terms of how you workshop something or how you thought you could be open to writing about different things through the encouragement of the workshop.
One thing that came out of this fellowship for me personally was that I have now an aversion to parachute journalism, and which is basically when you sort of drop into a community, do your interviews, and then you leave, and you really don't engage with the people and the culture of that place, whatever that place may be. And I think going forward, at some point in the near future, I actually want to go back to my motherland, which is India, and write about it from that place. I don't know when that will be, but I hope that it will be soon.
I guess for me, part of the wonderful freedom of this fellowship has been being able to bring myself into my stories. And I was a journalism and creative writing double major in college, and I felt totally burnt out at the end of college and didn't want to touch my creative writing thesis ever again. And 10 years passed before I ever got back into creative writing, and that was through taking a class at the workshop here early last year. And I think having the creative freedom that Noel provides of being able to bring myself into these stories and to show how I'm part of these communities that I'm reporting on has been really empowering. And I think that, one of the people who is in this audience is Cecile Chong, who I wrote about for my second story for Open City. She's an incredible artist. And she has her wonderful installation, The New 49ers, El Dorado, The New 49ers, coming to Wave Hill soon. And I think that a lot of editors would have said, no, you can't write about Cecile because she's your neighbor. But the fact is, I think her art is newsworthy. I think her service and decades working as an art teacher in New York City's public schools is newsworthy. And I think that her work and her message is timely. And so I felt like I was able to finally write about this artist who I admire so much with the freedom of this fellowship, which has been really great.
I think echoing Hannah, I think my conditioning was that I had a certain perception of what was newsworthy or interesting. And I think this group and this community really encouraged me to push the bounds of that, even in terms of medium. My next piece, I want to do a comic comparing the island I grew up on, Bahrain, with Manhattan as an island. And I was like, who's interested in that? But I think, and the third piece would be around Muslim dating apps. And I think and I didn't know who the audience was. I'm like, what, I constantly would doubt myself. And I think this group really pushed me to bring myself into the writing, which has always been hard. And I think having a community that can reflect back to you what you're writing, the stories, where they're coming from, it's been a gift. Yeah.
I think going forward, the thing that I learned most here is the biggest problem for marginalized writers is authority. It's feeling that as though you have the authority to say something or not, and that's kind of what we're all wrestling with. Going forward, I'm just not going to care as much about whether or not I have the authority to say something. I'm just going to say it. And I think I highly encourage everybody here to do that, because it's not, no degree, no credential is going to be enough for you if that's what you're going for. And so just write, just express yourself in however which way you can, and find a group of people. That's very important. I'm going to maintain the relationships with these brilliant writers, as well as seek out others.
Thank you. I think we had a oh, sorry, were you going to say something? Yeah.
Can I say one more thing? Another thing was that coming into this fellowship, I think a lot of a perception with my friends and with myself was that if this story has been told about this brown community or this, my experience has been told, it's been done. And I think coming into this fellowship, it really complicated my perception that for like decades and centuries, stories have been told repeatedly about white communities that are the same repeatedly. And I think so realizing that none of our stories are the same and that we all have space, that we're not operating from a principle of scarcity, that all of our stories deserve a platform. I think that's been really helpful and to me, yeah.
Thank you. We had one more question. Yeah.
You spoke, oh, I'm sorry. You spoke of, is this working?
Yes.
Yeah. You spoke about when you, home for you was when that man spoke Hindi, or woman spoke Hindi to you. And I was very interested in that because I'm wondering, most of you seem to be at least bilingual, and some of you might have grown up speaking Hindi first, I don't know. I'm wondering how your memories and emotions are affected by having two different languages. I mean, even the words that we have in different languages suggest different things, you know, like the Eskimos with it, I forget already, 100 words for snow. So, you know, I have worked with people, I'm a psychoanalyst, and I've worked with people who are from different countries and who had different, their first language was not English, and when they would go into the past, there would be so much deeper emotion, and sometimes memories would come forth that they did not have when we just did it in English. So I would be very interested to hear anything you can comment on. Thank you.
Yeah, I wish I could articulate what was triggered in me, but definitely I stepped out of that food pantry and cried. I think it was probably some sort of familiarity that I felt with this woman. But I think in general, I think what language does is that so often I've operated in a very sort of white-centric community, both in Australia and in America, where hearing my language spoken in a room is very rare. And so I think when I heard my language, not just on TV in a Bollywood film, but from one person to another, it was really a clarifying moment of this is a community and this community exists and it doesn't exist in an operation that's centered around whiteness. And I think that was really, apparent to me in that experience. And that was something that I really wanted to capture in my work as well.
I think we have time for one last. Oh, sorry, Syma, go ahead.
No. I was going to say, could you just reframe the question a little bit, just so that I make sure that I'm answering it, just to what it felt like. Yeah. Yeah. You know, it's really interesting because that question is something that preoccupies me a lot, more because I grew up speaking Urdu but as a child, but I got bullied as a 4-year-old. And so I think this girl used to hit me, and my mum, one day she said to my mum, my mum said, can you tell your daughter stop hitting my child? And she was like, if you teach her to speak English, maybe she can defend herself. So my mum went home and she told my dad, and my dad was like, that's it, we're just speaking English in this house. So Urdu for me is now a learned language. It's not, I know words, but I speak with a Scottish accent. It's not like, people laugh at me like in communities where that's the norm and I'm like, whatever. But but it's interesting for me because Scotland was also a place that was colonized by the English too, and and people spoke Gaelic. And there's a beautiful poet called Dean Cryan Smith, who's a Scottish poet, and he says a man who loses his language loses his world. And in some ways, when I hear sometimes music, it does make me quite sad because I feel like I've lost access to that world in some ways. And I think that's super important to reclaim languages and identities because, as much as I am Scottish, I'm also Pakistani Indian, and I think that language is such an important part of our identity, and I think that it does shape our memories and our identities in so many ways.
Thank you for that question. I think it presupposes that languages are these discrete things, and that's partly the problem, is that we operate according to prescribed notions of what is and what isn't, and how these certain things are bordered and not. And languages aren't two different things. It's not about growing up in two different countries or speaking two different languages. It's about not fitting in to prescribed things, right? To borders drawn up. This is how we speak English, this is how we speak Urdu or Arabic. Therefore, if you don't fit into either one, you're going to suffer.
That's not really my question.
What is your?
My question is really now, if you're very young and you're living, it's more what you were saying, is if you're very young and you grow up, like you're almost pre-verbal to just speaking, messed up sentences and stuff. You're being born, your emotionality is connected to that original language.
No, and I was. Yeah. Well, again, that's my point. Is your question is what about emotionality and how does it relate to an original language? But that's my problem. Is original language. That's my issue, and that's what I mean by borders, is to suggest that there is an original language, to suggest that my emotions are connected to this one language and not another is the problem. Because all of us speak different languages. Everybody here speaks a different language, multiple languages. We speak them at different times, at different places. We code switch regularly, and the reason we do is because, as Syma pointed out, danger or some external stimulus. But when we think about who we are, when we express ourselves, it's not in one language, it's not even in language, it's in thought. Language is a thing that we use to externalize these thoughts, whether in speech or in writing, right? But emotionality is not really meaningful unless it's expressed, right? So that's kind of the point here. But also, I mean, like, so whereas Syma was raised with a traumatic experience, I was raised with, we immigrated a year before 9/11. After 9/11 happened, my mom would not wear anything but the traditional thobe outside. My mom would not speak except in Arabic. My mom refused to. Yes, that is why I am the way I am. And so again, it's not that she spoke Arabic. It was the way that she responded to this very traumatic experience and the way that I was raised to understand that traumatic experience as a result. It's not about a particular language. It's not about expressing oneself in a particular language. It's about these external things.
Thank you so much. We could have a much longer session, but I think Noel is giving me signs that it's time. I do want to thank Noel, who's, I don't think, okay, Noel, can we have one more? Yeah, okay, one last, sorry, okay, one. Yes, please.
I'm wondering, as writers and like dealing with your identity and dealing with all of your trauma, and also like trying to be like a literary writer or whatever, do you feel at times you're just like, I'm a shit writer, but I have really important stories that I need to tell, and those stories are better than like take my inability to write like whatever person, yeah.
Oh my God, I have so many emotions about this. I feel like this question is for me. But yeah, no, I mean, it's something that I've been thinking about a lot. But I think without getting too much into my emotions about it, I think I just want to say that something that I've been thinking about a lot lately is the way that we think about talent and like the way that we perceive talent as something that is like inborn, or you're just a good writer or you're a bad writer. And it's like, especially as a writing teacher, I recognize that this is like completely false. And really, any form of talent is just working at something repeatedly. And often, to be honest, the reason why we think some people are more talented than others is primarily because they're privileged and they have the time and the space to write and create art and the money. Yeah, the money. Yeah. And so I think, or even just like, mental health privilege, being able to like get up and do it every day, And so I think keeping that in mind and knowing that, the world in some ways can feel like it's stacked against you, but knowing that it's not within you that makes the writing shit. I feel like I'm telling myself this right now. So I get it. I feel if that's where you're coming from, I feel that. So yeah, I think it's really important to remember that that essentially everything you need, you already have.
I don't know if this will be helpful, but literally everyone is a shit writer when they're it's a matter of like practice and editing and a whole lot of other things.
Yeah, I agree with that.
And that's where the group comes in, and a wonderful patient editor like Noel comes in too, and he's been so wonderful for I think every group that's been an Open City Fellowship group. It's just I'm thankful to him really for his patience and sensitivity and understanding.
Yeah.
So
I just wanted to say in answer to that question, everybody in this room has a story that they can tell or to tell. And I think that, you don't have to be an amazing writer to share it. You can share it through different mediums like comedy or filming, whatever your jam is, or art or whatever it is. But I think it's just really important to know that you have a story, that you have important things to tell. And I think that's part of being human, is sharing our stories and our histories and whatever it is that we have, because, that's really all we have.
okay, great. Thank you so much. Thank you to each of you for your amazing work, and congratulations. Thank you.